Welcome to this talk about Skaill farmstead on Rousay. We're going to be looking at the different techniques we've been using to investigate the site over a number of years. We've been working at the site from 2015 right through to last year, 2019, investigating the ruined farmstead that you can see in the picture here, with a kiln barn on the left and the farmhouse on the right. And we've been investigating the area of kind of rough ground and earthworks in and around that farmstead. This talk is going to run through some of the main techniques and then focus on the excavations results of the excavations from 2019. So for those who don't know, you can see Rousay there, one of the northern isles of Orkney, and then Skaill is nestled on the western coast, facing across to Einhallow and Einhallow Sound. So why investigate Skaill? Well, it gives us an important opportunity to investigate the development of the Western Estate, which has roots and is mentioned in the Orkney Inga saga. There's a long history of inhabitation along this side of the island. So we know the site has medieval roots, and it gives an opportunity to see if we can identify different phases of the site through into the last few hundred years. The site was also part of the Rousay clearances, so Quandle and Westness were part of a large-scale clearance, the only such event in Orkney in the mid-19th century. So we know we have an end date to the occupation there. So we know that there weren't people living there beyond the late 19th century. So can we identify these events and what was life like in the last few hundred years at Skaill? What's the relationship to Skaill between Skaill and its neighbouring sites? So there's the fortified Hall of the Work, which is just nearby, St Mary's Church, and then there's Broch farmstead, of which Skaill, nearby Broch, which Skaill was a part of until the end. So there's lots of questions we can look at when we're investigating Skaill. Is this a continuous occupation sequence at the site? Are there gaps? So what have we done? We've used a wide range of techniques, some non-intrusive, such as surface surveys, building recording, 3D modelling, walkover survey, and some intrusive. So we've been doing test pit excavation and excavation trenches at the site. So we're going to run through these different techniques and look at some of the results in this talk. The building recording. So we've been looking at the standing remains of the farmhouse and the kiln barn. So some of the remains are standing near to original height, with lots of features you can see there, such as fireplaces and alcoves and recesses in the wall. We found a cheese press, suggesting there was a dairy there in the 19th century. And then there's, of course, the impressive kiln barn with its fireplace and flue used to dry and then store grain in the nearby barn. So we've recorded the standing remains at the site. We've also done this by using a technique to create 3D models of the site called photogrammetry. So we're taking a whole series of photographs of all different angles around the site, which we can then use computer software to stitch them together and create a 3D representation of the buildings. So we've undertaken this for the farmhouse. You can see here, this is a still from the 3D model. You can explore the original model and zoom in and out and explore it in real space on the Sketchfab link shown at the bottom of the screen there. We've also put a number of markers in where you can zoom in and see different features. So the history of the farmhouse itself here shows that the farm developed from an original domestic dwelling on the left, and then it's extended again about 3 times, moving to the right to the remains that you can see that are partly collapsed there. And we've also undertaken a 3D model for the kiln barn. So the still you can see here shows the corn drying kiln on the right, the barn with its winnowing hole and storage and ventilation holes in the wall, and then there's a more recent extension built on the left-hand end there, which appears to have been another dairy. So a nice sequence in the kiln barn there. But these buildings appear to be 19th century in date, We know that the farmstead has Norse, possibly Norse, or certainly medieval origins. So where are these earlier sites? What evidence can we find for those on the in the area? So we've undertaken a walkover survey. Now, a walkover survey is a basic technique where you walk around the area recording earthworks, lumps and bumps. You record structures that might be above ground. So we've recorded about 18 sites in the area of Skaill. These include the obvious walls and buildings that you can see there, but also when the vegetation's low, you can see there's a whole series of enclosures, banks and terraces. And the walkover survey identified a building platform, number 209 there to the north, which looks to be the remains of a former kiln barn, which had been reduced to foundation level. So some important features and structures were identified in the walkover survey. Certainly the terraces and the banks show that there's an earlier site that carries on below the existing enclosure walls. So this gave us a hint that there was much earlier remains in and around the farmstead that were just showing through as earthworks and subtle features on the ground surface. All in all, this suggested that what we were dealing with here was a settlement mound, a mound where we've had an occupation for a long period of time, lots of building and rebuilding, creating different earthworks and features, and then culminating in the 19th century farm that we have built on the top, which was then finally cleared and abandoned. We worked with Historic Environment Scotland, who came out and did an earthwork survey of the farmstead. You can see the main farmhouse there in the centre and the kiln barn. The angle's just rotated to the left here of the map. But you can see the main enclosures there, but then in detail you can see the whole series of former field boundaries, terrace edges, banks that kind of riddled through the farmstead, carrying on underneath some of these walls. And importantly, some of this early work identified that the rectangular enclosure just by the farmhouse there actually predates the farmhouse that we have surviving at the site, because the material that carries on underneath the farmstead abuts this wall. So we know that we've got that enclosure dates to an earlier phase of farm buildings. We've undertaken geophysical survey. We've worked with the German Archaeological Institute, who have been out and used their very impressive cart, which you can see here is towed behind a quad bike, and that has a whole series of magnetic sensors arranged in a line there, so you can survey quite a considerable area in quite a short space of time. And this technique's magnetometry, so this is good at detecting very tiny differences in magnetism in the soil. So it's good for detecting things that have had human interference, burning, middens, anthropogenic activity. So it's very good for finding settlement. So they've conducted large-scale survey right up from Westness Farm all the way up beyond Skaill up to Midhow, found a whole range of sites from many different periods, which we don't have time to cover now. But suffice to say, the area just to the east of Skaill was surprisingly quiet magnetically. But there might be a number of reasons for this, that there might be material moving down the slope that's actually masking earlier remains. But this is a very useful tool for looking at this area in a wider context and putting the sites like Skaill into the bigger picture and showing how this landscape has changed through time. Focusing in more on the site at Skaill, the geophysical survey that the Archaeology Institute have undertaken is again a magnetometer survey. You can see the archaeologist on the left there holding a machine with just 2 sensors, and then you walk along a grid. But you can see the survey that we've undertaken within the enclosures around the farmstead itself shows quite a different picture. You can see all the dark shapes and lines, contrast between the positive and the negative, the black and the white, the grey areas being a kind of area of sort of general low magnetism. You can see a number of shapes emerging, a number of lines and edges, and lo and behold, these correspond to the earthworks that were visible on the earthwork survey, the dikes, the terraces, the platforms, and the banks. But you can see in the centre there's an area of considerable magnetic enhancement, and that's right in the middle of where we're where our settlement mound is located and visible on the ground. So a combination of non-intrusive techniques there that have really helped us understand what we have below the ground surface and what the potential might be for excavation and where we might actually fruitfully excavate in the future. So following on from our non-intrusive techniques, we have undertaken intrusive excavation. This was our first test pit right by the farmstead there in the rhubarb patch. And we chose to excavate there because there was lots of pottery and midden and evidence of occupation visible on the ground surface. And it's right in the centre of this settlement mound. So way back in 2015, we undertook our first test pit there. And funnily enough, we seem to have hit the jackpot straight away. Because in our small 1 by 2 metre trench, we found 4 structural phases. And about a metre down, we found that double-faced wall that you can see in the base of the trench there. This was then surmounted by another wall that you can see in the section. And this was then cut by a wall you can see in the far left there, which then directly underlies the current farmstead. So 4 phases of structural evidence there, culminating in the current farmstead. And little did we know at the time that this sequence of early buildings cut by later buildings, so the early buildings are on an east-west alignment, the later buildings on a north-south alignment. This sequence came to typify what we'd find in other trenches as well in the future. And crucially, the lower levels of this early test pit yielded some really key finds, such as the steatite, part of a steatite vessel. So that's a soapstone. It's not present in Orkney, probably imported from Shetland or possibly even Scandinavia. So when we're finding very large fish vertebrae, very large cod vertebrae at this level, which again is indicative of Norse fishing practices. So very early on, we knew we had, coupled with the geophysics, we had this really interesting sequence of structures with probably Norse structures at the very base. So beyond that, we then excavated a number of test pits. You can see test pit number 1 there, right in the centre. We've got a line of test pits running north-south up by the side of the house, and then east-west across the house, so forming a cross, so we can assess the depth and character of the settlement mound, find out what depth the archaeology is, what date it is, which will again give us an opportunity to sort of hone in with larger trenches and use our time on the site strategically to try and address the things that we're interested in. So there's a number of test pits you can see there. We're not going to go through all of them in this talk because we don't have the time, but just to mention a few. Trench 2 at the top there, the large blue linear trench, was put across the kiln barn that we found in the earthwork survey and the geophysical survey, and we found the remains of the walls of that structure surviving in the ground. Trench 3, down the far bottom right there, investigated one of those enclosure banks that we identified in the earlier surveys, and lo and behold, what we thought would be a simple bank turned out to be quite a complex sequence with a culvert and other midden enhanced deposit. Trench 23, which is just to the south of the farmstead, investigated another terrace, and 24, just to the left of that, investigated another terrace. And these were found to contain complex structures and a whole sequence of different layers, including midden. So were these early test pits around, and we identified that the farm mound is about 50 metres by 40 metres, and it's up to about 1.5 metres thick, probably even more than that in the centre. The deposits and the complexity of the deposits increase as you go towards the farmhouse. So the current farmhouse is basically sat right on top of the middle of the settlement mound, and around that you've got a very complex sequence of deposits, probably dating to the Norse and possibly earlier. So we'll just run through some of the results from the excavations in the 2019 season to focus in on some of the latest results that we've got from the site. So the view you can see there is a nice aerial view looking across the site with the kiln barn in the foreground, looking up towards the other sites in the area, such as the Mary's Church and the work, looking up towards Midhow. So looking straight down upon the site, you can see the trenches either side of the main farm farm building there. So we're investigating an area within the enclosure just to the west, and then the area sort of just adjacent to the farm buildings, looking at some of the more post-medieval remains on that side. So the main trenches that we're going to be looking at today are trenches 4 on the left there and 19. Trench 22 up to the top there, we did discover a whole series of the earthworks that were visible on the ground surface turned out to be a series of demolition deposits, probably from when some of these other buildings were decommissioned. But below that, we did find a Norse horizon, which is showing that Norse activity does continue out to that part of the settlement mound. And trench 20 there, you can see a very substantial wall, a metre wide wall that's over a metre high. So again, it just points to the complexity and the depth of some of the structures and deposits surviving on the eastern part of the site. But we're not going to go into that in too much detail today. We're going to focus on trenches 4 and 19. So some of just to mention, these aerial photographs have been taken with a drone. Bobby Friel take the high view. So we've been lucky enough to use this as part of our recording on the site, so we can use this to create kind of scaled images, where we can use that to help with our planning and recording of the site. But also these aerial views give us a really good interpretive opportunity to look at the site from above and try and understand how some of these different elements fit together from the different trenches either side of the farmhouse. So firstly, let's look at the more recent remains that we found in trench 19. So you can see there the surviving farmstead on the left, and you can see that building wall is actually situated straight on top of another wall, and that's the same sequence as we found in trench 1 all those years ago, where the current farmstead is built on top of the remains of another farm building. So it's almost like they've demolished that farm building and they've just built one directly, leveled off and built one directly on the top. And it's probably this earlier farm building that the enclosure to the west is contemporary with. So the whole farm has undergone some considerable remodeling and rebuilding. But how early and what do these earlier buildings date from? So when these earlier buildings were in use, you can see there's a passageway between two ranges of buildings. You've got room 1 and room 2 of some earlier buildings on the right there. Some of those have some quite complex features and other walls, but basically you've got a substantial building to the south, which has been then appended with another building to the north, creating this passageway. And there's a doorway and various blocked features that link in between. So you can see there, this is some of the early stages of excavation in that trench. Before we got into the different rooms, this is looking across where room 1 was eventually found. You can see this quite neat stone surface, and this relates to some of the later occupation on the site. Probably the occupants who were cleared in the mid-19th century would have been using this surface after these buildings have been partly demolished and gone out of use. And this area was actually used as a midden heap. So above this stone surface, and you can see some of the shell just peeking out of the section there at the top of the photograph, was covered in late 19th century midden. So lots of pieces of blue and white pottery, limpet shell. So this was the midden heap, and this whole area would have been an external yard or working area, but below which, of course, there's a whole complex sequence of buildings which we have then revealed. So here's some of the excavations in trench 19. You can see the block doorway there being excavated in the centre, and lots of the rubble and material being removed that had been used to backfill these different rooms below that surface that we saw in the previous slide. One of the surprises within the rubble was this horse skull, and this was from the southern room, which had been quite deliberately placed within the rubble the right way up. You can see a picture of it in situ there on the left, and then when it had been excavated on the right. It's actually quite an old animal. You can see lots of wear on the teeth. But interestingly, it seems to have met a fairly dramatic end, where there's quite a large butchery mark on the lower part of the skull there with the red arrow, showing that this horse was actually decapitated. So was it an old horse that had actually reached the end of its useful life and had been put to sleep? But why was it included in the rubble? It clearly had been deliberately placed in the rubble. within the backfill of this building. So perhaps it connects with the horseman traditions on Rousay, that were sort of a secret society of men that worked with horses that had certain rituals and traditions. We're still doing research into the horsemen, but it'd be quite an interesting link if we did have this sort of almost ritualized practice of placing this horse skull within the rubble of a building as it was being decommissioned. So within the rooms in these buildings, you can see that there's lots of flagstone floors. So these floors, we didn't excavate below them in 2019, so perhaps there's earlier structures below. So how old are these buildings? Well, at the moment, we could be looking at possibly 16th, maybe 17th, 18th century buildings. There's still quite a lot to unpick in this trench, and we're going to be extending the trench to the north and south. But certainly going on the evidence in some of the other trenches, it's likely that we've got a Norse horizon below this, possibly even structures. So does the remains of some of these earlier walls continue on this side below? But we're particularly interested in these later buildings as well, and it's a very rare opportunity to excavate these sorts of structures in an Orcadian context. A surprise find within the rubble room, one of the rooms in Trench 19, was this Norse bone comb, or a fragment of a bone comb. You can see there it's got some lovely concentric circle design on there, and some of the teeth surviving. So we think it probably dates to the 13th century, but it was included within the very loose rubble that had been filled within these buildings that date to the last few hundred years. But so it's amazing to think how this fragile object can survive many centuries of rebuilding on the site. But it gives us a tantalizing glimpse as to what might survive below this later phase of the farmstead. Another interesting find from the rubble of the infill buildings was this fragment of a large iron cooking pot. You can see the moulding marks on the side of it there. And these would have been a common sight suspended over the fireplaces in farmhouses in post-medieval period in Orkney. So just to recap on Trench 19, you can see we've got the main features there, the surviving farmstead, which is built above another wall, which represents an earlier phase of farm building, got the passageway and the two rooms. What we're looking at is a very marked change in the level of the ground. So when these buildings were deliberately decommissioned, the ground level rose considerably by up to a metre. And the same sequence, as I mentioned before, was found in Trench 1 on the western side of the farm building there, as on this side. So we're likely to be finding other earlier remains below. And this building here, room 1 and 2, are likely to represent what we have on the 1842 estate map here of Skaill. You can see the main range, building range depicted there, with this building to the east, to the right, just the end, so room 1 effectively is surviving there. But we know from the excavations that there was another earlier building to the south of that. So an interesting map just capturing part of the final stages of this farm building. So we know that these buildings are earlier than at least the 1840s, probably putting them back into the 18th century, if not beyond that. So we're now going to have a look at Trench 4 on the western side of the farm building, the farmhouse there. You can see with the walls and remains sort of poking out from underneath the farm enclosure wall there. It was hoped with this trench that we'd expose some of the walls that we found in Test Pit 1, which is just within the rhubarb patch there. You can see the large green leaves just to the right of Trench 4 all those years ago. And indeed we did. So these walls continued out from underneath the settlement mound. So effectively the earlier phases of occupation of the site were revealed in the kind of lower edges of the settlement mound. So the main features in Trench 4, you can see the very substantial wall in the northern part of the top of the trench there, with an opposing wall in the southern part of the trench. This gives us an internal dimension of about 5.5 meters, so a very substantial building internally. And then taking into account the walls continue right across this trench and then into Trench 1 to the right, you're looking at a building that's at least 13 meters in length, probably a lot longer than that. So a very considerable building, very substantial building, a substantial hall. And the main features you can see there, you can see at the top, you've got these stone benches that were built inside the wall on either side, set inside the walls there. But interestingly, we're picking up different phasing. So you can see at the top of the trench there, you've got this later wall which was built on top of the substantial wall that you can see in the northern part of the trench. So it seems like this building was modified. We've got different stages, different phases of building here. You've got the original hall, which is then modified. So the benches, the internal benches, could well be later features that have been built inside. There's a lot more work to do on this. There's the possible remains of a hearth with a wall either side in the middle there. Unfortunately, that central part of the trench was very disturbed by rabbits who undermined and dug into a lot of the occupation deposits. But we've got some very significant floor deposits that still survive, which have yet to be investigated. So lots of interesting things to look at in that trench to try and understand the different phases of this building and how it was used through time. So you can see there during the excavation of the hall, the large wall there, we excavated the trench out a little bit more to see if it continued, and it just keeps on going. So the building, we haven't found the end of the building yet either on that western seaward side. You can see the wall there continuing, and you can see how it actually continues with that later phase underneath the boundary wall there. You can see the depth of the base of that boundary wall that's actually buried. And then trench 1 was just beyond that boundary wall, so that's where those early walls were found. So a very similar sequence with a substantial metre-wide wall with a later wall then built on one side of it, and then that was cut through by the post-medieval farm buildings to the east. And you can see here on the southern part of the trench the stone benches with some upright stones kind of underneath supporting these benches. So these are where people would have slept. They may have eaten here. They may have had their food here, sitting around the central hearth within the building. So some of the key finds from the hall from the 2019 season was this rather nice spindle well on the top left there, which is actually the top of probably a cow femur which has been cut off and then bored through like that to form what we think is a spindle well. And then key find as well, we found in quite a lot, and that helps us date the site as well. We're finding lots of steatite. So the original steatite we found in trench 1, we're finding much more of that in trench 4. You can see here a really nice part of a bowl with chisel marks. Very soft soapstone just lends itself to sort of working and chiseling in different shapes and bowls. And so some key finds from trench 4. So all in all, the evidence that suggests this is the hall we're getting the right sort of artifacts that can date it to the Norse period. Architecturally, it's actually very similar to some of the other halls that have been excavated, or large longhouses that have been excavated in Orkney, such as Coigrill and Westry, Snoosgar, Bay of Skaill, and Skaill at Dearness. So there we're finding similar features, substantial walls, multi-phase buildings with these internal benches within the building and of a similar size. So to conclude, you can see from the recent results from the site that the quality and the depth and the complexity of the archaeology at Skaill is quite considerable, and it gives us a really good opportunity to look in detail at the changes in farming life, the changes in agricultural practice, in fishing practices at Skaill, through from the Norse period through a series of buildings and structures within our settlement mound, right up to the clearances. And indeed, we're finding evidence for the last inhabitants that actually lived at Skaill in some of the midden deposits and, of course, the structures. There's lots of work still to do. We need to investigate the hall and expose and investigate the internal deposits within that. And we need to expose some more of the post-medieval buildings to try and understand this complex sequence. I think in all the complexity of the more recent remains has surprised us at Skaill. Some of the buildings in Trench 19 are very substantial and are increasingly complex. So we've seen a whole series of different building phases and levelling phases at Skaill, which has resulted in the ground level going up, and then the construction of this, the final farmstead, the 19th century farmstead that survives as a ruin at the site. So thank you very much. If you'd like to follow up some more information, you can follow up there on some of the links at the bottom of the page to the Archaeology Institute website and the Archaeology Institute blog. So thanks very much and goodbye.